Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, how would you like to go to Bikini? I don't think anybody nowadays would want to go there, but we have somebody here who knows a lot about Bikini and has especially a lot of photographs of Bikini because his father was an official photographer who handled such matters. Maybe you think of Bikini as a certain kind of very scanty swimsuit that women wear. But before it was, in fact, I think they named it the swimsuit, which was extremely revealing, after Bikini, just to sort of take a ride on the shocking value, the intensity of emotion that the word bikini arouses in people, as it well should, because a lot of nuclear weapons were tested in the Marshall Islands, Bikini being one of them. Now, I have a friend who's here with me, somebody I've been getting to know a little bit over the last couple of years because we kind of travel in the same circles, online circles, watching and being concerned about global warming. And this is Dr. Tom Agoro. And Tom is the head of the Global Coral Reef Alliance. Have I got it right? Good. I remembered it that long. Okay. And Tom is, I presume, in his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
I used to live in Cambridge too, many years ago.
Yes.
Anyway, we're going to talk about Bikini. And he has a lot of photos that he could show, but I'm asking him to go light on the visual side because some of our audience is listening by audio only and probably couldn't get much out of a slideshow. But photos, are very important, very important. So, good morning, Tom. How are you?
Good, a pleasure. It's actually afternoon for me, but it's a pleasure to be with you on this program. And things I'd like to say that we first met a couple of years ago when I was invited as sort of a technical expert on soil fertility regeneration, and just in a very focused context. And so until then, I wasn't really aware of your amazing program. And then, looking through some of the listings of these things, I'm seeing hundreds of programs that I wish I had listened to. I still wish I had the time to listen to them. But anyway, but amazing stuff. So I'm blown away by all of it, and in particular the link to the Pugwash conference and the disarmament, and that's really the gist of approximate reason why we're having this conversation now, which is that recent program that you did on the failed efforts at nuclear disarmament between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Gorbachev.
Well, actually, they did make some progress. There was a cutback in the number of nuclear weapons.
But that their intent had been for that to be the first step towards real nuclear disarmament, and that it never went beyond that initial step because on both sides, the militaries, for their own reasons, did not wish to see any discontinuation of the flow of money into what they do. So, it's a pity. They came so close at that time, and it failed at both ends, I think, because the military and the people benefiting from that money were unwilling to make the compromises that would have been needed, and they were able to prevent top leadership from doing that. And Gorbachev didn't last very long. So it's really an unfortunate thing that was missed. And I mean, the thing that struck me is that the people you had on that program were the primary scientists and researchers and physicists involved in that from both the American and Russian sides. And, that was really incredible to have these people there because they were the ones firsthand who tried to verify that, in fact, you didn't have to be blowing things up and that you could have a much higher level of safety by testing and mutual assurance and, trust and all that sort of thing. and unfortunately, that didn't go through. But among those people was Dick Garwin, and I know Dick Garwin. I've met him a few years back, and at meetings. But the thing is that that's really pretty amazing. I mean, you may not know this, but he's sort of the master bomb and missile designer of the
You have
U.S.
mentioned that,
Yes,
and we did not
yes,
pursue
and he
that line of
normally
conversation.
and he normally doesn't speak about any of this stuff in public, so that's why I was astonished to see him on there, and really quite seriously. But the point is knowing what someone like him does, and he's an astonishingly brilliant fellow, knowing what he does and the fact that he was involved personally to be able to verify that nuclear bombs didn't need to be blown up nonstop, et cetera, et cetera, was really, really revealing. But anyhow, what struck me also was that none of them, although they're all older than me, and I think perhaps older than you too, are the fact is they were not involved directly in the events that led to the nuclear arms race that they were trying to control at that point. They're trying to prevent it getting totally out of control, and there was real reason to be worried about that on both sides because we had many close calls that were avoided only by accident,
Oh, yeah.
so that's another story. Anyhow, so the thing is that they made that effort now, but they weren't involved at the events that led to the arms race itself began. That's what I wanted to get back to. The origin of the bomb, the nuclear bomb
Yeah.
itself, and in part that came out of scientists' letters, physicists mainly, to the government saying that they'd better look into making the weapon to end all weapons or something, as they put it at the time, but basically a weapon so terrible that no one could stand up against it. That was the notion that every military always wanted to have, So at any rate, and they wrote that letter and they got some of the world's top physicists, including Einstein. Einstein always regretted having written that letter afterwards. He didn't regret that it helped end the war, but he himself personally refused to have any role whatever in weapons research. And the same was true of Norbert Wiener, who was the top mathematician in the world, the top mathematician of the century as well. He would not get involved personally at all, but he trained pretty much most of the mathematicians who did. There was unlimited money available, through massive economic distortions at the time that were made, that there's no limit to what they could spend. And they hired the best scientists in the world. Now, my grandfather was one of the people that they picked, and he invented close-up photography or macro photography. He was at the time a science photographer at Life magazine. He specialized in visualizing things that other people couldn't see. Inventing lenses or ways, polarized light, using all sorts of optical things to bring out features that you couldn't see otherwise. And he worked very closely, specialized in science illustration in particular to reveal what couldn't be seen otherwise. So,
What was your
anyway,
grandfather's name?
my grandfather's name was Fritz Goro, but he spelled the last name Goro. He invented close-up photography and macro photography, and he refused to take a patent on it because he wanted everybody to be able to use it, to be able to see what he could see and to explore the world around. He was picked as a photographer for the theoretical physics team of the Manhattan Project because of his, expertise in visualizing it. And he's basically picked to illustrate the physics and the whole process. So in doing so, he worked with the theoretical physicists. He had worked with Einstein a bit or photographed him, but that was not related to the Manhattan Project. But he worked with Oppenheimer, Fermi, all that. So he was documenting every step of this along the way. And with the result that when the first bomb was ready to be tested at Alamogordo in New Mexico, he was there. He was the official photographer there documenting it. He met with Oppenheimer the morning before they blew it up, and to plan out how they were going to document it. And he said that, now, I haven't seen the movie. I don't know how they portrayed it, but I mean, what my grandfather said was that Oppenheimer was like a racehorse about to run a race. He was twitching and moving and twisting his fingers, and like incredibly nervous. I mean, every part was like moving, or and with it was just really quite exceptional. But anyway, Oppenheimer was thinking he thought the smartest person he ever met, by the way. It's a long story, but my grandfather definitely was just so impressed. Like everyone who did know Oppenheimer was impressed with his brilliance. But he was there. Now, the result of that was is that as soon as the ground was cool enough to walk on, he was at ground zero with Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, who was the director of the Manhattan Project. Now, Groves was the guy running the whole thing, and he was a gung ho militarist. He despised the scientists. He had no use for them. He was there to build a bomb and build a bigger bomb and do it now. That's what he was there for. And so, as soon as the ground was cool enough to walk on, literally, they pulled linen socks over their shoes up to ankle height, and they marched out over the just cooled cinders out there, the remains of the tar that was there. And so I have all my grandfather's photographs of that. They're in a book I
Well,
wrote.
now, thinking back, I
Sure.
mean, did he ever say, what a stupid thing to do? Or did he think even later that he didn't suffer any real consequences? I mean,
Well,
I would not
this is
have done that, you
now this
know?
is an interesting part of the story. As a matter of fact, I have some of the specimens of the um, desert sand that was fused to glass by
Yeah.
that explosion. And I also have samples of the uranium ore from Canada that bomb was made from. Right,
Image
right.
that,
So they walked across the sand, and as I say, literally it turned to glass beneath them, or the sand. And he photographed that. Now, they took no precautions whatever. They didn't wear masks. They didn't wear radiation badges. Okay? Really, they did not. There was no precautions whatsoever taken except to wear these linen socks over their shoes up to their ankles to make sure they didn't kick up dust. You know, maybe they worried about inhaling dust, you know. I'm not sure. But that was it. So there was no precaution made there. And I know that because I have the picture. So subsequent to Alamogordo, then the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and no attention was paid to radioactivity. And when, in fact, the first reports came out that people were dying like flies because of what seemed to be nuclear radiation poisoning, the response of the U.S. government was to deny. They said these Japs are just making it up. It's just propaganda. They're just making it up. It's perfectly safe. It's just all hysteria, blah, blah, blah.
okay, how many people believe that? Did your grandfather believe that?
Well, that was the line that was put out, but I mean the thing is when the photographs came out, it was very clear what was happening. At that point, there was no denying it. I mean, now you see, in those days, photographs couldn't be faked. We talked about photographic reality. My grandfather, you couldn't fake a photograph.
Mhm.
Nowadays, of course, you can fake everything, and so you can't trust the images you see, and but that wasn't true then. So, at any rate, when the photographs came out, it was really clear that there was a problem. Now, the thing is that the military was so impressed with the results of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They thought this was such a neat weapon. They could go in because they were gearing up to fight the Soviets for sure. They were having to prepare for what they thought would be the next war, and they wanted this to be handy as a tactical weapon in warfare. They wanted to be go in, use a nuclear bomb on the enemy's military emplacements, and then march your troops right over the bombed area.
Mhm.
And that's why they needed to be sure it was safe for their own troops. Not they didn't care too much about the people they bombed, but they did care to some degree about their own troops. And so that then it suddenly became a medical issue. Is this in fact, safe to do? Okay, and so then the argument came with Groves as well. We've got to do experiments to see if there really is radioactivity in the bomb that we know. So what they did is they picked Bikini Atoll because the remote place they could find, the most empty remote atoll basically in the world that they could find. And there they were going to now blow up bombs under controlled conditions, one in the air, one in the water, or and underwater, and then various combinations just to see which was more effective at blowing up enemy ships and whether those ships could then be reused for military purposes after they'd been bombed. Okay, so they wanted to check the survivability of ships and all that sort of thing to these kind of things. And so they basically took pretty much all the captured Japanese Navy from the end of the war that they could find. They towed it in, and then a lot of, American ships that had been so severely damaged they basically couldn't be repaired, but things were still floating. So I forget the number of how many ships there were, but basically took all these ships into the center of Bikini Atoll and arrayed them at different distances from where they go to blow up the bomb to look at, which ones sank and which ones could then be reused. The thing is, Bikini Atoll is the most remote atoll, pretty much in the north of the Marshall Islands, and it was, in terms of deep time, it basically is part of a double chain of volcanoes that formed about 100 million years ago in the South Pacific, somewhere near where Tahiti is now, and got spread by this volcanic, the spreading center of the whole Pacific plate. After 100 million years up into the North Pacific where it is. The Marshall Islands is a double chain of atolls, each of which marks remnants of an ancient volcano that now sunk beneath the sea, but has left an atoll beneath
it. An atoll being a kind of a circular depression.
Yes, of coral. And that's what's distinctive about them. But the volcanic base is sunk deep below. In the case of Bikini, maybe 4,000 or 7,000 feet below. They've never been able to drill down deep enough there yet. And we thought they'd hit at 4,000 feet. And in Bikini, they think it might be much deeper than that, but they're not sure. Anyway, so what happened is as the volcanoes moved with plate tectonics and gradually sank, the corals grew up if they were shallow enough for the corals to go in shallow water and created rings of coral reef. And the volcano essentially disappeared and just left behind, the ring, like a ring around a bathtub afterwards, and those are the atolls. And that's where the corals managed to keep up with sea level rise behind basically a mark of their presence. So that's what the Marshall Islands, all these atolls are. I'm just back from the Maldives. I'm just back, in fact, from the largest atoll in the world, in the Maldives. Sea level rises, they're able to keep growing upward to match that, if conditions are right. If conditions at sea level rises too quickly, they get drowned. They can't keep up with that. So that's
why was the sea rising?
Well, because at the end of the last ice age, when the ice caps had sat on all those kilometers of ice that sat over the northern Canada, and all that melted away.
Yeah.
Okay, there's about 140 meters of sea level rise. That followed from the peak of the last ice age 18,000 years ago. So all that came out didn't happen continually, and it's kind of interesting because it was the slips and starts. Basically, as that ice cap melted, every now and then would pond a lot of water behind it, and every now and then with melting, some of that stuff would suddenly flash out with huge mega floods of fresh water into the St. Lawrence River in the northern into Baffin, to Hudson Bay and into the north, and that caused so much fresh water in the North Atlantic it shut down the overturning of the ocean and caused global climatic consequences. So that happened several times. And when that happened, there was a sudden push of that. Then the sea level rose too quickly for coral reefs to keep up with. So since I come from the island of Jamaica, I've been diving on coral reefs all my life. That's what my family does. And all around Jamaica, we have lines of old fossil reefs, semi-fossil reefs, at different depths that are those old reefs that were drowned as sea level rose at the end of the last ice age. About 3 or 4 of them that we would commonly dive down to different depths. You'll see them all around the Caribbean, and they're basically, those were shallow reefs, and they drowned when sea level basically, well, there was a very quick melt either in Greenland or actually with many of them it was Canada melting, and now Greenland and Antarctica. But that doesn't happen slowly and continue. It happens in slips and starts. Basically, the whole glacier slides and slips into the sea, and that's where would sometimes see. Anyhow, so the corals leave that mark, but in some places, like the atolls, have kept up all the way right up to the surface. And so Bikini Atoll was an example. With Bikini Atoll, the waters were about, I guess, 60 meters deep, 180 feet deep in the lagoon. So it was a perfect ring, incredible ring of sandy limestone sand islands, because the reef grew so well, so quickly, produced so much sand, that got cast up to make islands, and those were protected by the reef. And so every grain of sand on those islands came from something that was living in the coral reef. So they were so productive of life that they built up this whole island.
Let me go back. The sand itself is not produced by the corals. It's produced by something that lives in the coral.
Some of it is, but a lot of other things. Mainly it's actually produced by limestone-producing algae, the green and red ones, and some are by little single-celled organisms, some by coral, and some by snails, things that break down. But in general, actually, it's calcareous algae that are the major contributor in most places. We call it coral sand. The characteristic is it's limestone, and it's all the shell of something that was alive and lived in a coral reef. And so the reef is healthy. It's just producing lots of this stuff. And since it's growing, when waves break it in a storm, it keeps growing and protects it. Well, Bikini just had this incredible ring of reef all around it, and maybe, I forget how many, maybe 20 or 30 islands all around it. Most only about a couple meters above sea level. Mostly sand and mostly pretty pristine. Except where people had planted coconuts, and they lived on coconuts because it was often too dry. They didn't have much water there. You understand, these islands in the dry season didn't have groundwater, so they would live off 10 or 20 coconuts a day. The local people.
That was, my goodness.
And
it was
healthy for them too. Anyhow, so these wonderful islands. But anyhow, the thing is, all in the center of the lagoon of Bikini Atoll were corals that came up from the bottom right up to the surface. There were 180-foot tall corals, 60-meter high corals, and there are hundreds of them all over, and they're in the way of the ships that they wanted. They wanted to moor ships there where these corals were. So the very first thing they did was they dynamited them all. They went in and they just blew them all up. So, well, actually, that's not the first thing. The first thing they did, beg pardon, is they showed up at Bikini Atoll with no warning, and they told the local people they had to pack and leave immediately. Just go. You're moving. We're taking over your island. Later, a story was made up, about how they offered to lend their island temporarily, et cetera, but it was a propaganda story made up. But anyhow, and they threw off, I forget how many people it was, I think 168 islanders who had lived there for 3,600 years. They lived there for 3,600 years or so, and they lived in harmony with their environment because they're as isolated as anyone could possibly be on these islands. Now, and they replaced them with 52,000 U.S. military personnel on these islands. Well, the islands were able to bear 167 people. So let me, let me talk a little bit about the Bikini people too at this point, because I say they'd lived there for 3,600 years, and when Europeans came there, these people were the most isolated of the Marshall Islanders, but they had boats that had speed the Europeans could not believe. And the thing is, they went many times faster than European boats, and they could flip the sail and go just as fast in the opposite direction. They went circles around any kind of European boats. I mean, they couldn't believe how maneuverable they were and how fast they were. And these people were the masters of it. So even though they're in this really remote island, they could actually sail anywhere in the Pacific they wanted, as long as they could carry enough coconuts to drink from. That was the only thing that limited how far they could go, because they'd catch fish on the way. And they're just absolutely incredible sailors. And so they'd lived there for 3,600 years, and they could sail to other atolls if they wanted to trade, but they didn't have much to trade because, they didn't, the other people had the same stuff they did, which is to say coconuts and fish. Um, no. And they were so remote that when the Spanish colonized the North Pacific, maybe the Spanish might have visited it once or twice by accident, run into the island and, claimed it in the name of the King of Spain and all that sort of thing, and then headed off. And the Spanish sold it to the Germans, who tried to set up the Marshall Islands, a lot of the North Pacific, as basically coconut plantations, pretty much enslaved the local people in order to produce copra to make soap for the German market. And so they basically forced everyone to produce.
Sorry, to make salt?
Produce copra. Copra is a dried meat of the coconut.
Yes.
Well, that's what everyone in the Pacific was forced to produce in order to pay their taxes to the German government in these islands. So they had to produce copra from coconuts.
But what was the copra used for? The Germans
used to make soap. I mean, if you're not familiar with copra, let me explain. In these islands, the only thing they can grow is coconuts. It's the only thing that they can produce on it because they're so low lying and so forth. And what you have to do is you have to climb up the coconut tree, cut the coconut down, split it open, break open the outer husk, which is hard work, then break through the shell, and then you have to take the flesh that's on the inside and dry that in the sun, which it can't get wet in the rain or it'll go rotten. You've got to turn it over on a regular basis, and that takes several weeks to do, to dry it to what was called dried copra. That's what they would sell. The European, Germans, Spanish, Americans, English, whoever they were, colonial masters would demand that they be paid in dried coconut meat. And so it take literally weeks of backbreaking work to produce this stuff.
Except I can't imagine that Europeans were eating that much coconut.
Well, no, it was used to make soap. It was used, the dried coconut meat was used to make oil, coconut oil. Okay. And the coconut oil was mainly used to make soap. Okay, and so there was a huge industry on that. It was all fueled by basically the enslavement of a lot of Pacific Island populations for coconut plantation. Mm-hmm. Now, Bikini was so remote that didn't even happen to them. They were too remote to go and collect coconuts from. So, it was when the Germans were in charge for that whole German colonial period, the Germans might have shown up one or two times, demanded they be given a whole pile of coconuts and sailed off. And, another group might show up a decade or a generation later. But, it was that remote. Okay. When the Germans lost the First World War, the Japanese got the islands all across the North Pacific. So a bit of the history there. So suddenly, and the Japanese moved in huge numbers of people again. They just took over in terms of number of people. And again, they forced the locals to work or starve. And Bikini was so remote, the Japanese hardly ever showed up. They apparently had 2 soldiers there, and who killed themselves rather than surrender, and that was it. But it was that remote that basically nobody else really knew they were there. So they're pretty independent. So they were remarkable people for a lot of reasons. So they were just thrown off their island, told to leave immediately, and they did. Bomb tests, the things in Life magazine, and all the original pictures and all that sort of thing. And so I'm going to write a book about this with all the original pictures I have. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. Now, of course, there were what the censors allowed through, and they would not allow anything that they thought might contain the least hint of a secret. So they were pretty fussy about that. But anyway, but I have all the pictures of this and Bikini Atoll and what was done there, and all the people who were 52,000 people there who displaced everyone who was there. Now, first thing when my grandfather arrived, he set out photographing the natural history of the island. Bikini the birds, the trees, the plants, the weeds, the fishes, the corals. He did underwater photography there. In fact, he also pioneered high quality underwater photography. So he started doing underwater photography in the reefs in Bikini and kind of documented it before they blew anything up. Okay. And it was basically how it had been left behind when the islanders left, because he went to the islands that were not being built up by the base camps of the 52,000 people, most of which were on the boats that were moored where the coral reefs had once been, okay, that they blew up and were lying at the bottom. So they moored them there. There were whole floating cities there. I mean, I say 52,000 people, fueled with unlimited hot dogs and beer. Unlimited beer and hot dogs for these guys. So a lot of them. And so they built the base camps. They built all the places for which the bomb would be blown up, all the boats that had to be moored at different places, all that sort of thing. And then to photograph it, and they actually had most of the world's high-speed photographic film there. Almost all of it was there at Bikini to document it. So they had, camera teams all over the place. My grandfather was the official photographer, but there were whole troops of photographers involved because they were trying to have the best cameras they could and high-speed film at every possible corner that they could. There was a lot of images taken, most of which were classified, and only some of which is now beginning to be unclassified.
But your grandfather owned his own photographs and
oh yes,
passed them on to you.
That's correct. But I mean, he had to go through censorship, so these are the ones that the censors let him keep. And we do know that he had to fight with the censors, so to speak, with every single picture, to argue that it was so obvious or so innocuous that no one could possibly infer something of importance from it. You understand? And they had to be satisfied that there was nothing that anyone could possibly tell from it. You understand? But anyway, but I have all those, and they tell the key story. I mean, for instance, with Bikini, atoll. Well, what happened is that they had a lot of experimental animals exposed on these boats. They were moored at different distances of the bomb blast. Mm-hmm. Sheep and goats and pigs and lots of different sorts of animals put out there because they wanted to see if there really was nuclear radiation effects on the health, and that the claims of radiation sickness, blah, blah, were really true. And so they had a lot of experimental animals there. So my grandfather actually was the one documenting the medical effects of the nuclear radiation there and documenting those sets of experiments as well as the bomb blast. So, and those really tell the story because many of these animals developed horrific cancers and tumors and all that. And again, I have the pictures and the fish and things living in the reef, and algae got radioactive and so forth. He could take the pictures from its own radioactivity. And it's the following year they held the Bikini Scientific Resurvey in the first Bikini bomb test. So they did 2 bombs. Was in 1946. Now, so let me come back to that. So with regard to that, this book here is the official pictorial record of Operation Crossroads, which are those 2 bomb blasts. And as a matter of fact, there's photographs of it. And there's a lot of photographers in here. My grandfather's actually the only photographer mentioned by name here in this, even though most of these photographs are by other people.
Can other people get hold of that book? If our viewers wanted to buy a copy.
You'd have to do a search on it. I was able to buy it on the internet. I mean, it's the key thing of the official report is, look, when the first bomb blast went off, what they did immediately is they sent a bunch of sailors to clean the ships that didn't sink. So a whole bunch of ships, immediately sank. So they went to those that didn't sink, the closest ones, and the Navy ordered the sailors to go in there and scrub those things clean with buckets of soapy water and brushes with their hands. Okay? And you go right out there and scrub those damn boats clean. Okay? And that's what they ordered them to do. And
what year was that?
This was 1946. 45 was when they dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, actually, let me backtrack before I get to Bikini, because there's one little important bit of history in particular of interest to you that I want to mention. Before Bikini, right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the physicists were so shocked at what happened, at the possibilities of nuclear weapons getting in the wrong hands, which is exactly why and Einstein and Norbert Wiener refused to work on it, because they knew it would wind up in the hands of megalomaniacs. Mm-hmm. That's why they thought this was too dangerous a step even to go down. That was their point of view, and they were very militant about it. And then, as there was a lot of letters produced by scientists saying, okay, we won the war's over, let's stop. Let's not go down this road. It's time to stop. It's time to ban weapons development, nuclear bombs, weapons development entirely, and form a United Nations based around the idea of banning nuclear weapons forever, not even developing them as a weapon. And the very first meeting of the United Nations was actually the United Nations so-called Atomic Energy Commission, which was formed with the express purpose of trying to ban nuclear weapons development. Okay, and there it was pretty clear that the Russians could develop it if they wanted, and had very strong reason to want to have it as well, because once somebody else had it, their generals had to have their own too, and they would do anything and have any amount of money in order to do that. So it was pretty clear. But then the Russians offered to refuse to develop it. Okay, and actually it was the U.S. that wouldn't go along with that, curiously enough. Now, what happened is the U.S. sent a delegation led by Bernard Baruch, who was a very senior statesman. I'll come back to Bikini, but before this, this book you may not know, by Alice Kimball Smith, A Peril and a Hope, The Scientist Movement in America, 1945 to 1947. Now, she wrote this book basically about how the scientists madly sent out petitions calling for nuclear disarmament and prevention of any future nuclear weapons development. And there was a massive movement for that in that end. And so, and people were quite threatened about it. I mean, Oppenheimer was sympathetic to it, among other, and many of the people were. Now, what's interesting is that Alice Kimball Smith was at MIT. She's long dead. Her husband was the metallurgist who built the casing for the bombs and the fuses and all that. Okay, and his name was Cyril Stanley Smith, and I knew Cyril. I knew Cyril quite well. Cyril designed that because he was the best metallurgist in the world, and nobody else could build the thing. But once he saw how it was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he walked out of bombs research and never, ever got involved in it again. He refused from that point on. And he became an incredible historian of metallurgy. He was a professor at MIT. When Baruch went to the UN meeting in 1946 to try to prevent any kind of weapons testing, I think it was maybe early 46, fairly early 46, because what happened soon after, he took Leslie Grove with him. Groves was the head of the Manhattan Project. Okay. At that point, he'd already gotten rid of Oppenheimer. He took Groves with him. He had Groves sit right next to him as he pleaded, no, we all have to agree, no. So Grove never said a thing. He sat there, and there are pictures of them. Grove was absolutely silent because he was already planning the Bikini bomb tests and already racing full ahead, and nothing was going to stand in his way. Okay, and that was very clear. And this wasn't about science. The Bikini bomb test was about survivability of weapons on people to the possibility of nuclear radiation. Mm-hmm. That's what it was all about. It wasn't to do fundamental physics, really, or new types of bombs and all that. It was to see if they could reuse the stuff later and march their troops right over bombed areas, carpet bomb an area with nuclear bombs, and then send the GIs in. That was what they had in mind. So, and that's what was Grove had in mind. And so he was already planning Bikini. That was by 46 that happened. When those guys were sent to clean the boats, my grandfather was with them. And I have his pictures too. And this book, the guy who wrote this book is the grandson of the doctor who was assigned to check their okay,
What's his name?
James Nolan.
Hmm.
And Nolan, his radiation badge immediately went black. And he knew that they had to get off immediately. He began screaming and yelling at them to get off the boat right away. And the Navy officer countermanded him. He said, no, 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 these guys are going to stay here until they've scrubbed every bit of radioactivity off this boat. Okay? And he he ordered the doctor off the boat. Okay, Nolan. And now Nolan then went back and got them to stop. I mean, he went ballistic, showing the badges going black. He went, it was really exciting. So he saved a lot of lives. I mean, quite a lot of those guys died afterwards. But anyhow, so my grandfather, he saved my grandfather's life. This guy, his grandfather.
Now, give me an explanation for that. How come your grandfather could walk through the sands immediately after the bomb blast, and you are healthy? My ex-husband was in a Weetalk, and so far as I know, our son is healthy. So there are no lasting effects. But the guys on the ship were immediately in great danger. Why?
Well, all the other people, my grandfather lived till he was 86. All the other people who were there at Ground Zero died of cancer at a pretty young age, however. So, maybe he was just lucky. What can I say? Because he was certainly, he also went to the mine in the Northwest Territories where they excavated the uranium, and that was radioactive as hell. And he was at both Alamogordo and Bikini, and all that. And as I say, on the radioactive boat, it's so. But he didn't die of any radiation-linked cancer. So,
yeah, but you could have genetic.
We'll come to that.
So I would think even if I were you, I would be checking myself every so often.
But anyway, all the other people who were at Ground Zero, though, did die of cancer, might have been linked to radiation. But of course, a lot of them, like Oppenheimer, smoked like chimneys. Oppenheimer was a non-stop cigarette smoker, light each one from the butt of the one before. So anyway, and they all were doing that. If you look at the pictures, so they're all smoking like mad. So anyway, so we don't really know. But anyhow, my grandfather was one of the lucky ones, but many of the other people on that boat with him were not and did die. So that's left to go. So to come back to then, but the pictures really showed the story. Now, the next year, in 1947, they set up the Bikini Scientific Research Survey. Okay, that was a year after, and that was to see basically what the environmental impacts were, and to do fundamental science on where the radioactivity went, how big the holes were that they'd blown up, and all that sort of thing. And they had basically the best scientists they could find there for that. And so they had, a large team of people, physicists, biologists, collecting specimens and all that sort of thing. Now, it turns out that my father was on that team. Okay. Of students who they picked. Now, the whole scientific research survey was led by Roger Revelle.
Oh, yeah.
Roger Revelle. Now, Revelle, I'm going to come back to him too, because he's a very important person in both climate change and the history of science and funding. Because Revelle was in the Navy, but he was an oceanographer by background who had gone into the Navy to help managed making wave predictions, when it was safe to land the troops on beaches, in Normandy, for instance, and that sort of thing. And so he kind of led that, and he was sort of more of a physical oceanographer than anything else. But he was a very clever guy. I knew him personally very well. Okay, he was a friend of my family.
He was at Harvard, right?
He was at one point. That's correct. He was.
In fact, I think he was the one who ignited Al Gore.
Yes, that's correct. He was founded the Center for Population Studies at Harvard. He was basically was an oceanographer at Scripps Institute of Oceanography and at University of California, San Diego. He got fed up for a lot of reasons. He was passed over for being appointed chancellor of the university that he had created personally there, and for political reasons. And he went off, and but his view was is that no one was dealing with the really critical environmental issues, of which population was one component and environment was the other. And so he got himself appointed professor at Harvard, and he set up the Center for Population Studies, and a lot of that was related to CO2. I'm going to come back to that again a little later. I met Roger Revelle when he was there at Harvard. I'm from Jamaica. When I came to the U.S. to study, when I was 16, Roger Revelle was the first person I was taken to meet. But this was much later. Now, at that time, he was running it for the Navy, and so he picked all the scientists there, and he picked my father to make measurements of the CO2 and oxygen exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean, the pH of the water, and the growth of the reef to try to understand basically the CO2 cycle, because of course he was aware that CO2 was the major greenhouse gas, and that was a matter of concern, but it was within the background of the natural cycles that were very complicated. And he picked my father to make those measurements as his graduate student. My father was at that time simultaneously a graduate student at Yale University in ecology. And but at the same time, while he was doing a PhD there, he was also doing an MD degree in another city entirely. And so he was knowledgeable about how ecosystems work, but also about medicine and the physiology. And so he was basically trying to apply the medical sort of thinking about how CO2 worked. He knew a lot. He did know a lot about how CO2 was regulated. He did a lot of medical work on that as a student, and pH balance in blood and CO2 and all that sort of thing. So really knowledgeable about the CO2 cycle. So Revelle picked him because of his background to actually make the measurements here at Bikini Atoll. And that's what my father did. But he was also the diver who collected the radioactive specimens. So he was the first kind of diving marine scientist who was using a tank to dive in the water and collect things down below. And we have pictures of him, with dissecting radioactive fish. Now, my father then went on to kind of be the first diving marine scientist, basically, in the world, and dived on reefs and looked at the zonation of reefs and all that sort of thing. But he died at 45 of radiation-induced cancer.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, I was waiting for you to get to the story about the medical effects on the Marshallese themselves, because I have someplace in this apartment a DVD with a film about, I think it's called something like Nuclear Savage, I believe, close to that title. And when I'm through with this, I'm going to put in the title and the author or the filmmaker, so
Okay.
that I can't recall it right now, but I'll put
Yes,
it.
okay. Well, do send that to me. Yes. Now,
Yeah. But now the thing was that his film was
yeah.
very much about the way the U.S. government deceived and lied to the Marshallese,
Mhm.
what they were doing, moved them around, and really had absolutely horrible effects on their health.
Yes.
This man showed how the leader of the guy who was then the head of the Marshall Islands, I believe, went to Washington, and he was digging through the files and bringing out things showing that the Americans literally lied and said originally they were going to do tests on mice, on the radioactive the effects on mice.
Yes.
And they changed that to doing it on people on purpose. And they knew that these were going to have catastrophic health effects. So that whole film is just the worst indictment of U.S. policy I have ever seen in my life. When I showed it to my class, it's the only time when I was teaching at the university that I ever wept in my own class. But watching that thing made me just cry with remorse for what the Americans did to those.
Well, it is horrific because, these were people who lived in total isolation, in harmony with nature for thousands of years. The thing is, I know these people myself because I've lived on their islands with them. That essentially they wound up as so much radioactive debris because one of these bomb tests, the wind was blowing the wrong way and drifted right over the city of 20,000 Americans that they had on Bikini, the main island that the Bikini people had been on. So they got irradiated directly. A lot of those people died of cancer and stuff later. And again, they were sworn to secrecy for the most part. But a lot of American troops, many were irradiated directly and suffered severe consequences from that. And then in other places too. Now, what they did with the Bikini peoples, they basically led them to believe they could be back in a few weeks. This was a temporary period of time. They'd be taken care of forever. And they took them to Barren Island that had no lagoon. I mean, so the atoll people, they fish inside the lagoon because that's calm and protected from the waves. The outside's too rough most of the time. Sometimes the waves are so huge, But if you have an island that has no lagoon, basically you can't get into fish except when it's flat calm. Okay. And so they put them in an island that basically had no fish resource, and it didn't have any water either because it was too low and flat and dry. So they left them with a little bit of water, and they wound up a whole bunch of them starved to death on this island. And then eventually, by chance, a plane flew over them and noticed the people down there, and they went down and checked and found, my God, these people are starving, and they were promised we'd support them, blah, blah. Let's airlift them a bunch of stuff. So they airlifted them stuff it lost them for a little while. And then they realized they had to get them off there because they couldn't live on this island. It was an empty island, a barren island that was uninhabitable. It was not just uninhabited. People just didn't have the resources for a human population. A lot of those islands are like that. So too small, no water, groundwater, that sort of thing. So they then took them to another uninhabited island. They promised them a series of islands, but then they found they'd promised other people. At that point, in Weetalk, they became another target for bombs. After they blew up many bombs in Bikini and many in Weetalk, and they'd alternate between the two. So Weetalk was the next atoll over. So they had those people who had been displaced as well. So they kept promising them islands that were empty because they were uninhabitable. They just didn't have, the water resources where people couldn't go, and that's why no one would live on them. So there's always a reason for that, So anyhow, so they put them into a chain of those things, again, feeding them on surplus army meals because they had no food or water. And then they translocated them to the side of the runway of the Air Force base on Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And that was during the war that had dredged up a huge amount of reef to build a huge airstrip so they could send the bombers on to Japan. So Kwajalein was a U.S. military base. In fact, in that island where the Air Force court is, Marshallese are not allowed on those islands at night. Mm. They've got to go to other islands at nighttime. So that's still the case. It's still a restricted U.S. military base. So anyway, but they took the Bikini people and they put them in tents on the side of the runway for about a year and a half. Okay, living on tents there. And then they decided, well, we've got to get them some sort of other island. And they finally found another island that was uninhabitable, a place called Kili. And they basically dumped them there with a whole pile of goods and possessions in a boat so they could get supplies from, other atolls, maybe 100. This was a pretty remote atoll. It was uninhabited because it was really small. It was really remote and had no lagoon. It was just an isolated island there. And it was so rough most of the year that you could not safely get into the water. And I know that because I've been in the water on both sides and nearly got killed. So it's rough. So they put them on this island. However, it was a lot wetter than Bikini was. So at least they could grow food. But they basically put them on Well, you know the story from Canada or other places where Aboriginal people are basically put on the dole. So what they do is parachute them white rice, white flour, white sugar, lard, you know, the usual, you know, and they parachute them all this stuff in huge amounts. And they suddenly had all the white rice they could eat. So they all proceeded, you know, being on the unlimited dole to get incredibly fat and all get sick from diabetes, which I mean they're genetically predisposed to, but which diet has absolutely caused because people will sit down with a pile of white rice this big with every meal. People won't touch brown rice, you
Mm.
know. Yeah, white rice is what you know rich people eat. And all across Southeast Asia, you know, that's peasants' food. But every now and then, of course, if the supply boat breaks down or the weather's too rough to land on it, or something breaks down, then they could get isolated for 6 months or a year at a time before more supplies could reach. And then they could wind up starving in between. And that happened to them on this island several times as well. They're basically prisoners on an island that they can't fish from. So they're dependent on white rice and frozen chicken necks and backs from Arkansas, which arrive in regular flights unless the plane is broken down, in which case then they're in real trouble. Okay, now that island, up to about half of it is submerged in high water in the king tides twice a year. Kili.
Okay.
And, it's you know an isolated island with no lagoon off by itself, and they regard themselves as being in a prison. Honestly, I mean, I've lived on this island for a week, and they're wonderful people. Really, they really are wonderful people. When they were in exile before they got to Kili, they were downwind of a nuclear bomb blast on Bikini Atoll. The blue radioactive waste right over them. Okay, they were on that barren island where they were starving, and at the same time they were irradiated directly. And basically, they said suddenly all these white flakes were falling down. They thought it was snow, which they'd never seen. The children smeared it all over themselves, and then the skin began to fall off. And then women gave birth to what they called jellyfish babies. Babies were transparent, you know, and had no bones. And, you know, so it was really horrific. So it's a huge legacy of cancer that these people suffered that they were directly exposed to there. So, anyway, so about 2/3 of them are isolated on Kili, which is, you know, about as remote as you can get in the Marshall Islands, and with the entirely dependent on what comes in from the outside for food, except for those fruits, a little bit of bananas and stuff they can grow themselves, you know. So wetter islands they can. Now, the other third is an island called Edgett. Now, the thing is, Edgett is in the main capital atoll, which is Majuro, and that's where half the population is because that's where all the government is, all the politicians are, all the jobs, all the schools, all the hospitals. So if you want your children to go to school, if you want to get people to go to hospital, that you have to go to that atoll. It's that simple. The outer atolls just don't have those services. That's true in all of these countries. And basically, they've been given a separate island of their own in that atoll. The atoll itself is a chain of islands around the perimeter. It was built by healthy reefs back when the reefs were really healthy. And so in that island, you have to wade through 3 tidal passes to get to the main town, Majuro. So there's no road that connects it. So you have to go by boat, and if you miss the boat, you have to wade through the tidal passes. Okay? It's about knee deep. I've done it. I've done it because I missed the boat. So anyway, so the other third are on this little island, but they're there to be accessible to the capital. These islands, literally twice a year, are ankle to knee deep and sometimes waist deep in salt water. So that kills any land plants you can grow, breadfruit, even mangoes, anything else. So there's nothing, even coconuts are dying in some of these islands. So they're really being screwed by climate change. And Bikini Atoll itself was being flooded. There's no management plan for Bikini Atoll. They devastated the island. They left it infested with invasive species of plants, rats, rodents, cockroaches, and all of that. They killed the native birds on the islands that they did disturb, they bulldozed off the soil, they dredged up ocean floor and dumped it on top to have what is called clean landfill. And then they planted huge numbers of coconut trees. They're absolutely sickly because they're absorbing radiation from the groundwater beneath all the clean landfill. So it's just an ecological disaster what they did. So there's no management plan for that. So the island itself has been ruined itself, and they're isolated on these islands. And, I think and in a we talk, they bulldozed the worst of the radioactive waste into one of the bomb pits. And then they poured a huge mass of concrete and rebar over it. And it's that place called Run It. They put a dome in there.
Yes.
And Run It is rusting. With global sea level rise, it's being submerged under the ocean. It's cracking the concrete, the rebar, all the radioactivity is wasting out. This stuff has never been mapped properly. It's they've been left with again a radioactive waste, and climate change is drowning them. So anyway, it's something that we need to do because global climate change is a new nuclear war, and Bikini is a place you can see the effects of both. Now, what I saw when I was in Bikini and Edgewood and Killy is almost all the corals had died because of global warming. When you go into the water there when you can. The main corals were built, those reefs on all those atolls. That species pretty much all died from bleaching from high temperatures in 2016. It's pretty much wiped out. So they're in serious trouble. Sea level rise on all these islands is picking up. Yeah.
What if you were in king of the world and could do everything you wanted? What would you do now to help with any of what these disasters are that you've described?
Well, that's one disaster. That's out of these events we got uncontrolled nuclear proliferation and militarism distorting, putting our resources into killing each other rather than solving our problems. I mean that's a problem we have, and we keep developing. When we get new technology, we use it. The worst people take control and they use it for the worst purpose. And I think we're with climate change now, as of yesterday, it's essentially too late to save coral reefs from global warming. That's what I work on. We haven't talked about that, but I'm putting together what happened this last year with
You've given up
the worst
hope.
bleaching ever. Oh, it was the worst bleaching ever last year. I'm putting together a paper on that right now. So we're really being hit with climate change. Now, Roger Revelle was the person who called attention to that. He was the first scientist really to come out and help with making measurements of CO2. And, I have the original data that my father took for Revelle on that, which was never published, but it really is pretty beautiful data. But Revelle was really aware of that from the very beginning, back in 1940.
Well, I know that he taught Al Gore to be worried about
Al Gore was an
CO2.
undergraduate, yes.
But right now we have about 1 or 2 minutes we can spend more on this show, and I want you to solve the whole problem. 2 minutes to fix it.
Well, if we don't reverse climate change, we're in real trouble. And it's to save reefs. It's too late to do it. Even if we stop fossil fuels and bury huge amounts of carbon, we just can't do that quickly enough. And I'm afraid we're going to have to start looking at ways to increase reflectivity, one way or another, to cool the Earth directly in order to save corals. Because as the last 2 years have devastated coral reefs, there's very, very little left.
Will any of the coral reefs survive in the long term?
Well, not many. I mean, again, this paper that I'm about to submit has a fair bit on that, but essentially what we're seeing are weeds that don't serve any ecological purpose, and they don't build reefs. They erode the reef rather than build it. So we're losing the sediment, we're losing the protection from waves, and what we're getting replaces them. It doesn't serve the same function as a living reef. That's another story. It's really critical. So reefs, if we don't reverse climate warming right away, reefs have had it. It's basically what I'm saying. And
everything that you said makes me believe the Marshallese have pretty much had it too. There's no way of helping them.
Yes, they don't realize that yet, though, unfortunately. I mean, they don't see it happening. They're not really, they're sort of blind to it or don't want to see it. I've lived in all the atoll countries. I'm developing shore protection projects now for Kiribati and Tuvalu as well. So long story. I've got a meeting on that later today.
Well, I don't want to end on that kind of
Yeah.
disastrous picture, but I don't see any upbeat message
Well,
to
yes, out of control nuclear weapons and out of control climate change are sort of being promoted by the same cast of characters, people who are megalomaniacs for power at any cost, and it's being driven by the world's largest fossil fuel producers, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and a bunch of rather lesser characters.
Okay, my friend, I'm so glad you did this. It's
Okay, thank you.
extremely interesting, and God bless you. Oh, carry on, okay? See you.
Okay.
Take care, dear. Bye.